So after the introduction, we realized there's a fairly broad range of experience and range of interest for people around SAFe. So maybe we'll take up Grimo's suggestion and do a multi-part series. So today I wanted to talk about scaling agile, in particular using SAFe with Jira. So it's very much kind of on the tooling side is where the focus is. So for the agenda for today, very briefly, I want to talk about how does one scale agile? What does that actually mean for the tooling application? I wanted to talk about Jira, like I say Jira core, but it's really Jira software, like the elements of Jira before you add any add-ons, any other software attached to it. And then I'm going to talk about what are some of the things you need to add to address some of the shortcomings of Jira proper, let's call it that. I'll also go over kind of do's and don'ts that I've seen work well and not so much work well. I'll try and get to as much of the things that people talked about earlier in terms of what they were interested in, but hopefully we'll have enough content here that will at least keep you interested through this topic. There is definitely more to be said about SAFe and Jira than we could cover in 45 minutes. So we'll try and get there. So let's just dive right in. So how does one scale agile, right? I think one of the first questions a lot of people have when it comes to, all right, I've got a team, we're doing Scrum or some other element of agile, some other implementation, but now I have to do this across multiple teams, multiple elements in the organization. What does that mean? So there's a whole bunch of available methodologies that you can pick from. As I said, today we're going to talk about SAFe, the top one, Scaled Agile Framework. It's much more popular, at least from my perspective, talking to all the different customers that we have in the Jira ecosystem and outside of it as well. SAFe is definitely far and away the most popular one that people use. And I think that that's because it has a ready formula that gives you enough to go on to get started, whereas things like less work a lot more with principles, and then turning that or translating that into an actual, like, well, what does that mean for my organization is a fair bit more work. So one of the things I do want to mention, and these are questions that I would encourage you to keep in the back of your mind because they actually do matter about some of the implementation elements we'll cover later. But some of the things about yourself, because every organization is different. So just taking an implementation and dropping it wholesale on that is never going to be working. That's kind of a square peg round hole situation. So these are things to keep in mind because they end up having a lot of influence on how you end up implementing SAFe. So how complex the project is that we're going to start with. Are we talking about web development? Are we talking about an entire web app? Are we talking about automotive? I heard come by earlier with some people. So are we talking about the research and development all the way through the production line of a car? So there's a whole range of the scope that we could end up working with. And the reason that's important is because you're going to talk about teams that are going to be added. How many people do you need to onboard at a time? So this is also the incremental aspect of it. How are the current teams? Are they familiar with Agile, or are you having to teach them those elements as well? There's a lot of coaching that goes with it. And all these things make it a little trickier, but it also makes it a little longer before you can actually get your first program increment, your first train, as they call it, up and running. A few other things that I think are actually quite important for a successful scaled agile implementation are knowing whether you're going to be scaling bottom up, or are you kind of scaling top down or from the middle? And what I mean by that is what level of support you have outside of the individual teams for getting agile. Are you going to go from your team to the adjacent teams and then the program of work and then slowly work your way to the portfolio? Or are you going to say, look, we're going to take this whole portfolio of work and we're going to do all this, and where everybody's going to go at the same time, right? So where does the increments start from a SAFe transformation perspective? And then lastly, I think one of the most underrated elements that comes up a lot is before you start with your transformation, one of the things that's really important is how do you plan work and milestones right now? Because those things will have a lot of effects. They'll leave a lot of fingerprints on how you end up doing things with Jira and with SAFe. So this is the big scary picture from SAFe. This is the full implementation of 5.0 SAFe for enterprises. You can also do only the bottom half. It's called Essential SAFe. A lot of people will start there. The only reason I mention this is because this picture has evolved over the last couple of years. It went from 4.0, at least when I started watching this, to 4.5 to 4.6 to 5.0. It sounds very software-like. But the emphasis, at least for us, when we're talking about Jira and the implementation of Scaled Agile, a lot of it ends up being in the bottom half of this, where Essential SAFe happens. So we're talking about the release train, which is essentially kind of a team of teams. It's not exactly that, but for now, let's keep it simple. They align along what's called a value stream, so it's not quite lines of business as traditionally businesses end up doing. But you'll see that different teams can use different methodologies still. You could still have a team working in Scrum or XP, or different teams using Kanban. And I think that that's an important element that you don't want to disrupt too much when you start implementing Scaled Agile framework. However, there's also a lot around this, right? One of the major pros that's also kind of the con of the Scaled Agile framework is that it's a complete framework. Like it tells you, this is how we're going to be doing this. This is how we're going to start. There's an element of top down. Again, it depends where you start. But you'll end up trying to implement what that looked like, that previous screen. And then either along the way or after you've run several iterations at that stage, you're going to start evolving what your particular implementation of SAFe looks like based on results that you get, based on the feedback of your teams. And so oftentimes you'll get kind of your flavor of SAFe. So a lot of the things will still be there. And a lot of things will get tweaked, obviously, to make sure that it's as successful as possible for your unique organization. That's also kind of the success of SAFe, right? It's prescriptive to a point, but it also is flexible enough, dare I say it, agile enough to adapt to the situations as they happen. There's also a lot of guidelines, a lot of use cases. It's relatively easy to find consultants who can help. I'm always a big proponent of don't try and reinvent the wheel when there's people out there that can help you. It ends up saving time, especially when we talk about scaling things. We're talking about more than just 20 people. We're talking about usually hundreds, if not thousands. So any type of efficiency you can win by bringing someone external in has the potential to gain a lot of man hours that you can then use for, your core business. So that's the brief introduction, or the briefest introduction I can give about SAFe. I'm happy to share more opinions on that maybe when the recording is off. But for now, let's talk about Jira and Scaling Agile. So right now, we're going to talk purely about Jira, the out-of-the-box, if you will. It doesn't matter if you've already been using it or if you're going to start with SAFe and Jira at the same time, because all the decisions that you're going to make, they're going to be the same. They're the same pros and cons that you have to weigh. So Jira works great for teams. Teams love it. It's obviously doing very well. But it also is very focused on an individual team, right? And by definition, they're supposed to be relatively independent and autonomous when it comes to making their own decisions. So it gives you a highly configurable tool, which is great when you're talking about one team. And it's great when you're talking about multiple teams that are acting independently as autonomous entities. But when you're scaling, especially when you have to coordinate work across multiple teams, that's a double-edged sword, because that configurability can also lead to a lot of challenges in terms of understanding what they're doing and how it relates to what everybody else is doing. So it's a great foundation when used right, but you need to make certain tweaks so that not just information can roll up correctly, but you can understand one another when you're talking across 3, 5, 10 different teams. There are certain things that need to be standardized. And I think that's always a lot of is the metaphor that I like using. As long as you can templatize to a degree and standardize enough so that one team can look at the information of the other team, whether it's their backlog or the current in-flight progress, and understands what's happening, where the blocking elements are, what's in progress, what are the prioritization elements. The rest of the details in terms of how they want to track things, whether they Kanban or XP or Scrum, that doesn't matter. But that little bit of information in terms of being universally signaled this is the current state of the project, this is what's coming, and these are our immediate concerns around blocking elements is basically key to the success. And that starts with the tool, but it's often also a reflection of the process you have in terms of how loosely connected and how loosely communicating are the two teams or the three, however many teams there are, obviously, in the way of work, right? Whether you have a Agile Center of Excellence or some sort of Scrum of Scrums meeting or a separate kind of get together, as long as there's communication, we should be in a good place. Jira also has, obviously, Jira projects. For those of us who've been doing this for a while, Jira projects don't always map to actual projects or even products. But essentially, over the hundreds of conversations I've had with customers, the rule of thumb that works most of the time, I think, is you should have a separate project for anything in the program level. So everything above the epics. You should have a separate project, Jira project, at the portfolio level. So whatever you end up calling that, whether they're initiatives or whatnot. And then anything above that, every level gets its own project, because you're going to have different rules in place for each one. And you want to be discrete in where these things live, because there are going to be different stakeholders. And it's just easier, instead of making them Jira experts, to give them their corner where they can see, this is what I own. These are the adjacent elements that I care about. But these are also just, there's a distinction between I own this needs to stay up to date, and this is where I'm just getting information from. And then finally, for each team, I highly encourage you to have a separate Jira project for each team. So those are just kind of the rules of thumbs. And there's also a lot of conversation when you start implementing SAFe, whether you should follow the Atlassian hierarchy, which is initiative, epic, and story, or the canonical SAFe one, which is epic, feature, story. At this stage, I've also formed opinions on this. If you are on-prem, it doesn't really matter, to be very frank. You can tweak how Jira is configured to the point that you can see epic, feature, story and still retain a lot of the tool's power. You can go initiative, epic, story and be just as fine. As long as you're consistent across, it shouldn't matter. If you're on cloud, now I haven't seen a lot of people implement SAFe on cloud, but I'm sure it's coming. You want to start off with the initiative, epic, story. So off the bat, deviate from the SAFe documentation, just because you don't have that level of control to say, hey, I want to rename all my epics to features and then still keep my team boards, my Scrum boards all in the same place. Anyway, that aside, briefly talking about workflows. Like I said, keep things in separate projects so you can kind of templatize the workflows. You can therefore contain the amount of different ones you're going to have. You're going to have a lot of non-technical people involved. They have a high level of comfort with Kanban boards. There's a higher level of intuition to that than Scrum boards, but again, just use what works. It just ends up becoming a problem when you start putting more and more items in a single board. This applies to both Scrum and Kanban. Works for 10, works for 15 items. But as soon as you're starting to look across a whole program or release train, these interfaces, they're not going to cut it. They're not going to give you enough. And we'll go over some of the options later. Scrum boards have the same thing. You're going to be crossing multiple sprints. You can put multiple concurrent projects, sprints on one Scrum board if you want. I wouldn't recommend it. It's not a great interface for that. It's great for teams. It's great for Scrum masters when they are looking at planning this particular sprint or looking at what's coming ahead. But it's not designed to give you tracking of dependencies. It's not really designed to give you a good overview of what your backlog looks like when you have multiple dimensions that you have to prioritize across, right? And when we talk about different metrics that you could use, it's not just story points, but you'll do business value and various other things like weighted shortest job first. You need a different way to track those things because this interface is very specialized and good for what it's doing right now. But when you have to manage and keep track across a portfolio of items, it's not good enough, to be very frank. But that's a limitation that we know about. It's good to know where the edges are of what you can get out of Jira. The last thing is how we link these items. So as I mentioned, we'll have a hierarchy that needs to be reflected in the way we link items inside Jira. Links can be very flexible. that's also one of those double-edged swords. You should have discipline and also a little bit of validation / admin discretion to lock some of this down. I think best practice is generally to keep the amount of links to a minimum. It's easier to set rename a current link type to something more generic so that the same canonical meaning gets used. For example, a blocking dependency, if it really is this needs to finish before the next item can start, use that one. Don't let each team have their own separate naming convention. As long as you're consistent across the instance, you should be good. Another really useful tip would be to keep relationships that aren't hierarchical, so not parent-child type of linkages, like to like. So epics don't only block other epics. Stories only block other stories, because oftentimes that's really what the meaning is, right? This story will block these stories. It doesn't really block the whole epic. If you're doing that, then you're not quite chunking most of the time very well. So that's good practice. At least I've seen instances with 50 different link types and it just becomes a mess. So best to avoid that where possible. Let's talk about some other tools, because so far what we've done is we've laid the foundation. And I always come back to the house metaphor, right? We're laying the foundation so we can actually build something on it. It's kind of boring to talk about the foundation, but boy, do you know how bad it is when there are cracks in it or it's not even or anything along those lines. So it's important to have mentioned that, but we're going to be building on it because we need to expand. We have certain rituals we need to accomplish, whether that's PI planning or backlog grooming or our RTE sync or Scrum of Scrums. There are various things that we need to enable with these tools, right? There's a tooling, there's a process problem, and there's the people. Tooling cannot fix any process problems. That's an important theme that'll come back later. But anything that we have successful from a process, we can add efficiency and add output by having the correct tools. So I want to talk about some of the tools we can add to Jira to make this easier. Let us start with Confluence. The obvious pairing with Atlassian's Jira. Certain things don't need to be Jira tickets. I think strategy and anything kind of at that level doesn't belong in its own Jira ticket. I think Confluence pages, they can be linked to Jira tickets and they're ideal places for that. The rule of thumb I always try and use is if it doesn't have a workflow that it goes through, i.e. it goes from to do, in progress, and done, then it doesn't belong in a ticket, right? You don't have a strategy that's kind of in the to-do phase or in the done phase. It's just kind of is. And the same applies to things like requirements, documentation, feedback collection. There's a lot of stuff you can use that shouldn't go in tickets, shouldn't go in comments. You shouldn't be creating custom fields. It's easier to put a Confluence page in there, link it, and then you're good to go because you can constantly reference it. And it allows you to track information in a centralized way that you can kind of, reference regularly and keep clean, because keeping Confluence clean is a task in of itself, but when done well, it's definitely a force multiplier. Two other things just worth mentioning on Confluence. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but searching Confluence is not easy. So that's going to be a challenge, generally speaking. So you'll want to have a strategy on how the information is organized within Confluence. And lastly, there's a lot of resources out there. I know there's a company called K15T. I believe they're in Stuttgart. They have a lot of great resources around what they call gardening in Confluence. So that's managing and making sure that the information can grow in a correct kind of organizational way. So I think that those are some useful elements to reference there. And then we get to kind of tools like for project management, for PI planning. There's a lot of it. So Jira has an add-on called Advanced Roadmaps that's also made by Atlassian. It kind of comes for free if you have a certain tier in a cloud. DC, it's also, I think, part of the enterprise level package. You have Easy Agile, which makes a whole suite of story mapping and PI planning tools, which are really great. My company, ALM Works, makes the Structure family of products. We make Structure Gantt. There's Jira Align out there. There's a product called Big Picture. It's recently acquired by AppFire. And there's a whole host of other things. And I'll give you some examples of what we can do with these. I highly encourage you to try them all out because they're all very good, but you want to find a tool that allows you to take the way you work and translate it to the tool, not a tool that will ask you to change the way you work. So that's kind of a challenge that I see a lot. When you need to kind of bend yourself into weird shapes to align with the tool, it's probably not the right tool, or there's something wrong with the process. So there's a lot in the ecosystem, and that's also one of the big strengths of Jira, right? Jira is never meant to be a fully contained, like everything's in here, you don't need anything else. It was designed with, we're going to focus on the core functionality and we're going to make it extensible so that you can kind of bolt on or add extra things that you need. So let's talk about some of the things that you will need to successfully scale what you're doing with your teams. The first one is the full hierarchy. So this is either called the work breakdown structure. A lot of people refer to it as the kind of the context of the work that you're doing. And what's really key here is you want to share this information with everybody because it tells you how your work fits into the larger picture. When you're talking about scaling agile, what you really want to do is empower the teams to make the right decisions. And that starts with giving them all the information they need. They have the information on their own task, right? They are subject matter experts on software development, HR, whatever it is they do. They need to know how it fits into the larger organizational strategy goals and things like that. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. You can do this by sending them information in the form of emails. You can do this by sending them links. You can do this by putting in Google Docs and Confluence pages, but generally speaking, because it lives and it's a constantly changing landscape, I think that a combination of Jira and Confluence is the way to do it because they work well together. And it gives you also the ability to track all these things like risks, like blockers, reporting to leadership on progress. In structure, this is what it looks like, right? You build a hierarchy, you can put the strategic themes at the top. So even Confluence pages will fit in there. And then you can track progress, risks, roll these things up. It's really useful because it's adaptive to the way you work. And there's a lot of ways to do this. Obviously, you can develop something like this with advanced roadmaps, and it can give you different slices of your Jira data. And what's important is that it shows you across projects, as you can see from the keys here. This works with multiple projects. And you need to be able to see all the information you want, and ideally not more. Because it's very quick when you're dealing with thousands of issues, if not more, you can lose sight of the forest for the trees, and that's kind of a problem. So that brings us down to another thing that you're going to need, and this is in particular useful when you start planning things like your program increments, and that is kind of a focused hierarchy, a subtree of what's going on. So instead of the full work breakdown structure of everything we're trying to achieve in 2022 or whatever scope we're working on, you want to be able to track by program increment, by release, by various other entities, by team. And that's another thing that you can do in Jira in a lot of different ways. You can use easy agile programs, you can use structure, you can use an advanced roadmaps to track just the team's work. And it's helpful to have that separate from the whole work breakdown structure, because the questions you're going to ask of that information is different, the questions of the full hierarchy. What I really have seen be successful is when this allows teams to track not just their own work, but their teams and their fellow like adjacent teams in the value stream, how they're working. Primarily because we're all working in Jira. So all the Jira data is considered central source of truth. And as long as everybody agrees to that process, there's an element of peer pressure that allows the teams to say, hey man, I see you haven't updated that ticket that you started this sprint. It's Thursday or whatever day of the week it ends up being when you do this. I need you to update it so I know what's happening. And so what that allows you to do is you can check Jira and hopefully save yourself a status meeting, because that's kind of where a lot of work goes to die. And it's kind of the boom or the main problem for teams is when people are in a meeting where they are reporting information, but they're not getting anything out of it. That's a problem. And that should be something that you can do another way, right? So if you do that simply put in a structure. You can throw that all together and just say, hey, these are the epics that we're doing in this PI. These are the stories that go with it. These are the statuses. These are the people that you need to talk to about those particular stories. And that's it, right? That's all you need. You can add story points if that's something that you're currently tracking, right? Are we doing capacity planning, making sure we have enough capacity this sprint to do it now, or do we push it later? And like I said, you can throw Confluence pages in there. That's a little trick that I've seen very, very helpful. A lot of feedback, especially early in your scaling agile journey, is little stuff that comes up while you're doing your day-to-day stuff. And if you only collect feedback at the end of the 2-week sprint, at the end of the PI, most people will forget 80% of the stuff that kind of irritated them and that got in the way. But if you put it in the same place and it's just one click away, they can just go in, type in their thing and be like, hey, I ran into this thing, the button doesn't work, or the link is broken, or whatever. And these are low-hanging fruit type things that often end up having, a lot of streamlining ability in terms of your team processes. You can make your engineering process easier. Oftentimes it will increase the capacity of the engineering teams to just do work. And what I've really found is just you collect so much more, but it's all the little things. And it makes everybody feel happier, because the little things that are irritating, that aren't good enough to bring up in a major feedback session, like if someone sends you a survey at the end of 2 weeks, you're not going to mention those, or you're not going to be able to fill it in because there's a character limit. But these are great things that you can just throw in, and you can do them per PI or per fixed version, however you want to track these things. Per sprint could even be a possibility. And you capture all this feedback that you should be fixing. And the earlier you can fix it, obviously, the better, because the less damage it's done. Last thing I want to mention from a rituals perspective is PI planning. So for those of you who've never been a part of a PI planning session, in the old days, you were recommended to all go to the same place, and you would spend 2 days kind of horse trading and haggling over what work we were going to do this quarter. I don't know if it's considered kind of blasphemy in the right safe circles, but PI planning is glorified quarterly planning. Except it has the teams directly involved. They have input on what's happening, what can we do, can we do it in this order, stuff like that. And so it's a great way for businesses to tell teams like, hey, these are our priorities, these are our strategic objectives. Is this a realistic plan? And you get feedback in a concentrated, like, this is the only thing we're doing here. And then you can set up what's called a program board. And you can then see like, hey, we are now all committing to this particular outcome at the end of this quarter. What's easy though, or what's great, is that you have a lot of tools that will give you the program board. Easy Agile Programs is one. A lot of the other tools like Structure on Cloud will have a program board too. What you really want though is during those negotiating sessions is you want something flexible. And this is actually, so structure doesn't get used a lot during PI planning, but it does get used in this particular way. I just grab the items I care about and I look at the blocking relationships, just so I can tell you like, hey, this thing is blocked by these things. So we need to do them in that order. These are kind of non-traditional hierarchies. There's a lot of stuff you can do with formulas nowadays to figure out like, hey, are we doing the right thing at the right time? Probably a rabbit hole to dive down some other time. But there's a lot of information that lives inside Jira that isn't consumable through the normal interfaces. You can't get it through the Scrum Boards. You can't get it through the Kanban boards. You can get really complicated with like Script Runner and write some of these queries, but you'll have to rerun them every time somebody updates information. And generally speaking, you'll want to do as much of your PI planning live in Jira as you can, because it allows, again, teams to reference other teams' work. You can update blocking dependencies. You can update the status of various things, whether it's like, hey, we're going to commit to do this in this sprint, or this is the due date because there are some external constraints. All that information is useful and very pertinent, so it should be accessible. Not to mention, normally, if you've seen the pictures from the SAFE fellows, they'll do these things on big butcher paper with Post-it notes, and they'll tie string to it. And invariably, the first PI planning session, half these Post-it notes fall down. You can't remember what was happening in what sprint. Major pain. So that's helpful from a PI perspective. The last thing I want to mention, and again, this agile advanced roadmaps, big picture, structure, all have these. I want to talk about Gantt charts because while it's kind of a dirty word in the agile community, because Gantt was always the prototypical, like this is waterfall planning. If you use Jira data, Gantt charts are very helpful because they'll show you the current actual plan for what things look like. They become a responsive tool as opposed to a prescriptive one. And so when they're part of the feedback loop, you can look at the current progression of how long something is scheduled to take. And when people make changes, like when releases get pushed out, information gets updated, new blocking dependencies show up, you want a critical path. A lot of management people like those things. You can put them all in the same place. You can track milestones. But instead of this being like, this is the plan, I need you to execute accordingly, this becomes at the end of this particular feedback loop. This is what it looks like right now. Either this is accurate or there's information missing in Jira, both of which are action items that we can use. Either this is accurate, so let's plan around it, or we need to update our Jira tickets. And you can do this at multiple scales, which is where I think this is very helpful for agile teams in particular to communicate their statuses to other teams. Because when you do this at the sprint scale and you see things across multiple sprints, you can have an idea of like, oh, hey, when is this epic going to be done? When is this initiative going to be done? And you can see, oh, hey, all these items have been scheduled in sprints. Great, I have a realistic idea of when this could be done. The further out, obviously, the less reliable some of these things are. Some teams will end up planning and they'll throw everything 2 sprints from now because they think eventually it'll get done. But because of PI planning, you're already committing to a lot of these things in advance. So when the first thing slips, you'll see this problem kind of bunch up towards the end of the PI, and you'll start to see, all right, well, what are the first things that are going to fall off, not be completed? What do I need to do? And for people who are in project manager roles, release train roles, so RTEs, it's good to know these things in advance because it gives you more options, right? You have to talk to stakeholders, figure out what contingencies are. Is it possible to just skip this one, or is this a problem that we need to address differently? You can also, again, because this is information that coming out of Jira, you can also use it to pull in capacity information. Is this plan even feasible? Or am I asking people to do 100 or more % of their allocation, right? The famous quip that project managers are the type of people that think 9 women can birth a baby in 1 month. Not true, obviously. So you have the ability to add sanity checks towards your teams and say, hey, these things are over allocated. This is not a good, this is not a realistic plan. There will be problems. And you can do this during PI planning sessions or afterwards. And this is kind of good information because you want to do this. And in particular, and this is something I mentioned earlier, cross team. When you're doing this the same way, and it's not so much we're going to build a Gantt chart the exact same way. It's more of this information is our current plan. You can reference it, and so can the other teams that have dependencies on you. It allows you to communicate without having to set meetings. It allows you to communicate actual problems before they become major roadblocks. And then the last 2 things I wanted to talk about are some don'ts. So especially with the Jira elements, there are a lot of things that we can do. There are recommendations for how we architect the schema, the data, what goes into what project. I'm happy to talk about what are custom fields and what are not that you need. But there are a few major things that you should at least be aware of, because it's not so much you don't want to do this, this is a problem and you're not asking the right question type of situation. Most of it centers around, as I mentioned earlier, the difference between a process problem and a tool problem. So for example, you might be asking, like, how can I visualize blocking dependencies between multiple teams? Which is a valid question. That's something you want to track both in flight and in planning situations. But if the problem isn't so much I can visualize it or I can't find a nice interface for it, but the teams aren't updating their Jira tickets, then this isn't a tooling problem, this is a process problem. And there's a lot of subtle things like that where a lot of people will try and bring in a tool because it's easy to say, hey, let's just install this and then it'll work. to try and cover up a process problem. And so this is 90% of the conversations I end up having with people trying to do scaling agile. It's often a distraction from the actual problem. The process solution will always yield much better results than any tooling solution you try and put on it, right? There's the Band-Aid on a bullet hole type of metaphor that you hear a lot. But what's the problem there is you could bring in a tool and you could get a little bit more efficiency out of what you're currently doing. But if the process is broken, you should address that first, right? The tool is never going to fix the process. That's not what they're designed to do. Like I said, I don't recommend you change the way you work to fit a tool. Jira is very flexible. Most of the add-ons are also very flexible. If you want to track PIs and fixed versions, great. If you want to track PIs in labels or custom field, that's fine too. A lot of the tools are happy to adapt to that. There are two things that are worth keeping an eye on, though. One is silos. And there's this kind of element of you want to find the balance of how many meetings are we having. Because like I said, not all communication needs to be in a meeting, especially if there's not something you're going to get out of it. But that doesn't mean that every meeting is something to be avoided, right? There's a ticket, whatever, look at it in Jira. Very important is that teams still proactively communicate, but they should do so in a way that they're both getting something out of it. So when a team says like, hey, we're, for whatever reason, like 3 people are out sick or have left, or we haven't been able to meet our hiring quota, a lot of turnover in these teams, we cannot meet the deadlines that we set during this particular program increment. We need to talk to these other teams. We should be actively having these conversations to find solutions. And when you create these silos, whether it's per release train, which is a common problem I've seen across SAFe, where one release train is doing their own thing, and everybody has to relearn all those mistakes when you launch the next train, right? If there's no communication across different elements of the organization that are doing relatively similar things, even if it's a different value stream, they're both part of a release train, they're both using Jira, they're both trying to corral, all these people to get them to work on it. Regular sync ups, because they talk, they can share information. There's a lot of nonverbal stuff that just gets communicated that would otherwise be missed. So try and find a balance between proactively communicating and then not having too many meetings is kind of what I'm trying to say. Like I said, there's a lot to go over when it comes to scaling Agile with Jira. I tried to cover a lot of the basic stuff today. But if you have any specific questions or kind of specific topics you want to dive into, I am happy to address any and all of them. So by all means, fire away.